Hi guys, we're going to talk about chapter 19, and this is going to cover organizational, interpersonal, and group communication. We know communication is key to nurse manager position. It's key really for anybody. Communication will be done with patients, colleagues, superiors, subordinates. We know that nurse practice tends to be group oriented, so interpersonal communication among group members is necessary for continuity and productivity. Organizational communication is more complex because of more communication channels, more individuals to communicate with, more information to transmit, and new technologies that can complicate as well as ease of delivery. So in this chapter, we're going to look at different forms of communication, barriers to communication, channels and modes, how to communicate assertively, nonverbal, and how to continue to use active listening as a means of interpersonal communication. So let's get started here. When we define communication, we say it is the exchange of thoughts, messages, or information by speech, signals, writing, or behavior. Communication can occur verbally or non-verbally. Communication impacts all management activities and cuts across all phases of the management process. The ability to communicate effectively often determines success as a leader manager. Communication begins the moment that two or more people become aware of each other. Communication is perhaps the most critical leadership skill. Effective communication requires the sender to validate what receivers see and hear. Organizational communication is a high-level management function. Common elements to the communication process include internal and external climate for both the sender and the receiver. The message can be delivered written, nonverbal, or verbal. As we look at internal and external climates that exist in communication, we can define internal communication, which includes the values, feelings, temperament, and stress level of the sender and the receiver. The external climate would include status, power, and authority as barriers to manager-subordinate communication. Both the sender and receiver need to be sensitive to the internal and external climates, because the perception of the message could be altered depending on the climate that existed when the message was sent or received. Effective communication requires the sender to validate what receivers see and hear. So what are some variables that affect organizational communication? These can include the number of levels that communicate, the gender, and power and status. People at lower levels of the organization hierarchy are at risk for inadequate communication from those higher levels. Gender definitely plays a factor because men and women communicate and use language much differently. When workers feel unimportant or ignored, job satisfaction and teamwork decline, and it becomes difficult for leaders to address problems that are affecting the ability of the organization to function and change. Open communication cannot be underestimated by the manager. So we've talked a little bit about these, but differences in gender, power, and status can definitely significantly affect the types and quality of organizational and unit level communication. So nurse managers just have to be very mindful of those aspects. Although organizational communication is complex, the following strategies increase clear and complete communication. Leader managers understand the organization's structure and recognize who is affected by decisions, whether formal or informal. Communication needs to be considered. Formal communication follows the formal line of authority in an organization's hierarchy. Informal communication occurs among people at the same or different levels of the organizational hierarchy. Communication is not a one-way channel. It must be clear, simple, and precise. Senders should seek feedback whether communication is received. So one way to do this is to ask the receiver to repeat back what they've just heard. Multiple communication methods should be used, so providing a variety of communication modes increases the likelihood that people will actually hear that message. And it is unnecessary information should not be disclosed. So what are some of the channels of communication? Communication channels used by the manager may be upward, downward, horizontal, diagonal, or through the grapevine. In upward communication, needs and wants are communicated upward to the next level in the organization. Downward communication flows from the top to the bottom. Horizontal communication are individuals that interact with each other on that same hierarchy, so like your peers to peers. Diagonal communication is the interaction with individuals from other departments and groups who are not on the same level of organizational hierarchy. And then grapevine communication flows quickly, haphazardly among people at all hierarchies. This communication is subject to error and distortion because of the speed at which it passes and because the sender has little formal accountability for the message. So if you think about the telephone game, right, that's through the grapevine. This person tells this person who tells this person who gets it to you, right, there's room for error and distortion because of how many people it's gone through. So the most informal communication network is often called the grapevine. Grapevine communication again flows quickly, haphazardly among people of any hierarchy. So your upper management, your middle management, your subordinates, it can happen really anywhere. Senders have little accountability for the message, and often the message becomes distorted as it speeds along. So again, that telephone game is a really great example. Typical modes of communication include written, face-to-face, telephone, and nonverbal. Written messages allow for documentation, can be open to various interpretations, most used by managers. I would really highly suggest written communication being the best communication, right? If it's written, then it actually happened. Face-to-face or oral communication is rapid, but may only reach a few people. Managers communicate verbally upward, downward, formally, and informally. Telephone communication is also rapid and allows the receiver to clarify the messages at the time of delivery. And then nonverbal cannot be obtained by the sender or receiver with this mode of communication. It's just those nonverbal cues. This could include facial expressions, body movements, gestures. This form of communication is considered really more reliable than our verbal communication because it's conveying the emotion. Effective leaders need to be congruent in their verbal and nonverbal communication so that followers are clear about the messages that they receive. So as a recap here, the clarity of the message is significantly affected by the mode of communication, meaning written, face-to-face, telephone, or nonverbal. So in general, the more direct the communication, the greater the probability of clear communication. The more people involved in filtering the communication, the greater the chance for distortion or error. So what are some elements of nonverbal communication? Nonverbal communication makes up about 50 to 70% of all communication. Some of these elements can include silence. Remember, silence can be an okay form of communication. We just have to be mindful that too much silence can be awkward. Space or proxemics. The degree of space we require depends on who we're talking to, as well as the situation we're in. Different cultures may require greater space. 6 to 18 inches of space is typically considered for that intimate relationship, right? That's pretty close. 18 inches to 4 feet is an appropriate distance for personal interactions. 4 feet to 12 feet is common for social distancing or social exchanges. And we learned a lot about that during the pandemic. Greater than 12 feet is a public distance. This distance may imply lack of trust, lack of warmth. Inadequate space may make people feel threatened or intimidated. Environment is another element of nonverbal communication, is the area where communication takes place. That's the environment. Appearance can be non-verbally communicate through our clothing, our hairstyle, use of cosmetics, and attractiveness. Eye contact invites interaction and emotional connection. So if it's not too prolonged, breaking eye contact suggests the interaction is about to cease, right? If you're looking at somebody, you're making eye contact, and then all of a sudden you look away, that person's thinking, okay, well, they are done with me, right? It suggests to listeners that you may not be interested in them and or not engaged in that conversation. Posture can influence your nonverbal communication. So if we're sitting up straight, it may indicate that you're focused, you're paying attention. If you're slouching, right, that can imply some type of boredom or indifference. Gestures can take on an added emphasis. Too much can be distracting. So some gestures, like you're nodding your head and you're smiling, right, you're engaged. If you have your arms crossed and you're kind of frowning or looking down, right, also could be distracting for your person that's speaking. Facial expressions and timing really must agree with the message, right? If I'm smiling while I'm giving bad news, that's not agreeing. So making sure that it agrees with the message. Managers with a pleasant and open expression are perceived as approachable. On the other hand, hesitation often diminishes the effect of your statement or implies untruthfulness. So if you're about to speak and you hesitate, one may think, was that really true? That just came out of your mouth, right? Vocal expressions such as tone, volume, and inflect really add to that message. So the goal should always be to convey confidence and clarity, right? You're going to walk into a patient room at some point and really they're going to ask you a question and you're going to have maybe no idea how to answer it. But if you convey confidence and clarity, it's going to inflict that you are a great nurse. So even if you have no idea, make sure you're still confident and you can be clear with your conversation. Don't lie to them, but be confident. Congruence of verbal and nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is really considered more reliable. We've talked about that than the verbal communication because it's conveying that emotional part of the message. So in general, verbal and nonverbal messages are not congruent or they're incongruent. The receiver is going to believe the nonverbal over the verbal. Verbal skills are an integral and critical part of leader managers. The inability to communicate needs or challenges other people's ideas can cause tension. It can lead to stress. It can lead to anxiety and even depression. So what are some types of verbal communication? These can include passive, aggressive, and assertive. So let's look at each of these, and then we may look at some misconceptions. So when we think about passive communication, this occurs when a person suffers in silence, even when the person feels strongly about an issue. It avoids conflict, often at the risk of bottling up feelings, which may lead to a later outburst. That's your passive communication, right? You keep it all inside. Aggressive communication is generally direct. It's threatening, it's condescending, it can infringe on another person's rights, and it intrudes into that person's personal space. Okay, aggressive. Passive aggressive communication is an aggressive message that's presented in a very passive way. I'm sure you all have experienced someone with some type of passive aggressiveness. Assertive communication is a way to communicate that allows people to express themselves in a direct, honest, and appropriate way that does not infringe on others' rights. So you can be assertive without being aggressive. If you're aggressive, you're infringing on those rights. If you're assertive, you're just being very direct and honest in a very appropriate way. So what are some misconceptions and myths about assertiveness, right? Because how many times have you been assertive and people think you are coming off aggressive, right? So what are some misconceptions? Assertive communication is a way to communicate that allows people, again, to express themselves directly, honestly, and appropriately. All behavior is either assertive or passive, true or false. We know that's not true, right? Because we've talked about several types of communication. To get what you want, all you have to do is be assertive. Those that are assertive do not always get what they want. It really involves both rights and responsibilities. To be assertive is to be aggressive, and we've talked about that, right? Assertive communication is not rude or insensitive. It's having an informed voice that insists on being heard. Assertiveness is unfeminine, right? It's okay as a female to be assertive. Assertiveness communication is rude or insensitive. This communication is not rude. It's having that informed voice that wants to be heard. So those are your misconceptions and myths about assertiveness. Don't get assertiveness confused with aggressiveness. They're definitely two different communication styles. They can look similar, but there's definitely a difference between the two of them. So when you feel like you are under attack by an aggressive person, what can an assertive person do? They can reflect the speaker's message back to him or her. This will help the aggressor evaluate whether the intensity of his or her feeling is appropriate to the situation. Make sure you repeat the assertive message. Repeating the message will focus on the message objective content, and this will be more effective when the aggressor overgeneralizes or seems to fixate on a repetitive line of thinking. Point out the implicit assumption. This involves listening closely and letting the aggressor know that you've heard him or her. Restate the message by using assertive language. So by rephrasing the aggressor's language, this is going to diffuse that emotion. Paraphrasing helps the aggressor to focus more on the cognitive part of the message. And then question. If the aggressor is using nonverbal clues to be aggressive, it's okay for the assertive person to question that behavior, so that the aggressor is more aware of those nonverbals, because maybe they're an unwarranted reaction. All right, let's talk a little bit about SBAR. This should be very familiar for you, right? SBAR is a communication tool. It's a standardized communication tool that's critical to patient care and reduction of patient errors. SBAR stands for Situation, Background, Assessment, and Recommendation. Do we know who used the first SBAR? Actually was the U.S. Navy. When do we use this SBAR? During handoffs. What happens if we don't use the standardized communication tool during handoffs? Adverse events can happen, medical errors can happen, decrease in communication can happen. Some facilities have implemented the iSBAR, which just adds that introduction step, especially if the staff have not worked with the patient previously, right? If you're taking over for lunch, if you're taking over for night shift, right, and you didn't work with them the night before, that introduction could be very beneficial. Most people here actually retain only a small amount of the information given to them. So to become better listeners, leaders must become aware of how their own experiences values, attitudes, and biases, and how they receive and perceive messages. They also have to overcome information overload that can be inherent in that middle management role. Good listeners are able to ask great questions. Boynton suggested that using a listening model such as GRR, G-R-R-R-R, is helpful where disruptive behavior, toxic environments, and power struggles interfere with listening. So when we talk about that GRR, it stands for greeting. This is where dialogue is established, respectful listening by giving each other time to think and transmit critical information without interrupting. Review occurs when the speaker summarizes the information they have conveyed to make sure the message was understood correctly. Recommendation or request. And then the last one is reward, when the communication exchange ends and both parties have collaborated. So this GRR is a listening tool. Most people, excuse me, hear or retain only a small amount of the information given to them. Written communication used by most managers comes in the way of a memo. Business memos have a twofold purpose. They bring attention to a problem and they solve problems. Components of a memo include a header, meaning to, from, the date, and the subject, an opening, context, and task. So what's the purpose of the memo? A summary detailing the ideas or plans. So this is the details. It's summarizing the details of the memo. And a closing segment with any necessary attachments. So this is the action wanted from your reader. This slide should be just review for you and a good reminder for principles of social networking. I'm not going to read through all of those, but remember your ANA and your NCSBN principles for social networking as nurses. Again, more review for HIPAA that was established in 1996. HIPAA called for strict protections and privacy of medical information. Confidentiality can be breached legally only when one provider must share information about a patient so that another provider can assume care. Ransomware and cyber attacks is kind of a new thing. Ransomware is a form of malicious software that can lock and encrypt a computer or device data and then demand a ransom to restore that access. Anyone can unknowingly download ransomware onto a computer by opening up an email attachment, clicking on an ad, following a link, or even visiting a website embedded with malware. As a result of ransomware, more than 25 million patients have experienced personal health care record compromise. Ransomware attacks threaten patient care and data privacy. Healthcare organizations must be proactively utilizing effective tools to prevent, detect, and contain these attacks. Employees must be cautious and conscientious computer users and avoid downloading and clicking on unknown sources. The protection of patient confidentiality and assurance of safe patient care is an essential leadership responsibility. The electronic health record, or your EHR, is a digital record of patients' health history that may be made up of records from many locations and or sources, such as hospitals, providers, clinics, even public health agencies. Included in this information are patient demographics, progress notes, problems, medications, vital signs, past medical history, immunizations, lab data, and radiology reports. So again, just another form of communication between providers. Again, HIPAA compliance, remembering to secure our medical information. There's rapidly flourishing communication technologies that really have great potential to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of organizational communication. They also, however, can pose increasing challenges to patient confidentiality. So let's talk about group communication. And we know that this is different than individual communication. In order for groups to accomplish work, they must go through a sequence of stages. These include forming, storming, norming, and then performing. The forming stage is where introductions take place, interpersonal relationships are built, expectations are defined, and directions are given, right? We're forming those relationships and expectations. The storming stage begins to feel comfortable enough with each other to compete or disagree. If managed appropriately, it can lead to trust, positive competition, and effective bargaining. The next stage is norming. These are where rules are established, work starts to take place. This stage may not take place if no one takes the time to agree. And then the final performing stage is when the work actually gets done. That's the performing stage. So just understand the differences in that group communication, right? We go through these stages relatively quickly. I think if you could think back on your first day of nursing school, right? You were forming those relationships. You probably went through some storming between your peers, and then you agreed, right? You started to do the work, started to get into that norming, and then you were able to perform and get some work done. There are 11 tasks that each group performs. These tasks include the initiator. This is the contributor who proposes group goals or redefines the problem. The information seeker, the information giver, the opinion seeker, the elaborator, the coordinator, the orienter, the evaluator, the energizer, maybe the cheerleader, the procedural technician. This one facilitates group action by arranging the environment, and then the recorder is that last one. Group task roles contribute to the work to be done. Group building roles provide for the care and maintenance of the group. So some examples of group building and maintenance roles include encouraging, harmonizing, compromiser, gatekeeper, standard setter, group commentator, and follower. Organizations really need to have a mix of these members in order to build the group and maintain those roles. Group members also carry out roles that serve their own needs. Managers need to manage those members so that those individuals do not disrupt the group productivity. So the 8 group member roles that could be problem roles are our aggressor. They typically express disapproval of others' values or feelings through jokes, verbal attacks, or envy. Our blockers are our negative Nancy roles. Recognition seeker works to focus positive attention just on themselves. Our self-confessors are another member. Playboy is your cynicism, your nonchalant, maybe horse player of the group. The dominator will attempt to control and manipulate the group. Help seeker, and then special interest pleader. Managers must be well grounded in group dynamics and group roles because of the need to facilitate group communication and productivity within that organization. So I'm sure as I'm going through these, you guys are probably thinking about your peers, right? We all can play a role in our groups. When we think about communication and team building, it is the responsibility of a leader manager to use communication in such a way that it builds team relationships for a mutual goal. Leaders must be effective communicators themselves and role model excellent communication skills in all settings. In addition, leaders are responsible to establish and uphold administrative structures to require and support effective teamwork and communication in their organizations. Finally, leaders must have the skills to effectively confront, manage conflicts that arise out of poor communication. And that concludes chapter 19. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email or we can chat about it in class. Thanks, guys.